After the wedding, Ryan will convince her to sell the house. She'll never see it coming, my future daughter-in-law's mother said in flawless French, just a few feet away from me. Then she laughed. The others laughed with her. They thought I was just another quiet American widow smiling politely through a family gathering. What they didn't know was that I had spent 12 years living in Paris. I understood every single word. I'm Helen Carter. I'm 69 years old, a widow, and the mother of a wonderful son named Ryan. Until that afternoon, I believed I was attending a joyful celebration. It was supposed to be a relaxed lunch at a beautiful vineyard outside Napa Valley, one of those elegant places with rolling green hills, white tablecloths, and waiters carrying trays of sparkling water beneath the California sun. Ryan and his fiancée, Chloe Bennett, wanted both families to spend time together before finalizing the wedding plans. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. Ryan had called me 3 times beforehand, excited about introducing everyone. He sounded happy. As a mother, that was all I ever wanted. Ever since my husband passed away 7 years earlier, Ryan had become the center of my world. Not in an unhealthy way. I had my own friends, my own routines, and a comfortable life. But Ryan was my family. Seeing him build a future with someone he loved filled me with pride. When I arrived at the vineyard, Chloe greeted me with a bright smile and a warm hug. Her mother, Monique Bennett, was charming as always. Elegant. Well-spoken. The kind of woman who could make an insult sound like a compliment. We spent the first hour discussing wedding flowers, catering menus, and guest lists. Everything felt perfectly normal. Then lunch was served. At one point, I excused myself to take a short walk through the garden paths surrounding the patio. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of lavender and freshly cut grass. As I rounded a stone wall near the edge of the property, I heard familiar voices. Monique was speaking with 2 relatives from her side of the family. They were speaking French. I almost smiled. Hearing the language again brought back memories of my younger years. Then I heard my name. I stopped. Helen is easier to manipulate than I expected, Monique said casually. The others chuckled. My heart skipped a beat. I remained perfectly still. Once Ryan marries Chloe, everything becomes much simpler, another voice replied. Especially the house. They laughed again. I felt the warm California sun on my face, but suddenly everything seemed cold. I could have walked away. I could have confronted them immediately. Instead, I stayed silent and listened. Because something told me those few cruel sentences were only the beginning. And deep down, I knew my life was about to change in ways none of us could yet imagine. I returned to the patio with the same calm smile I had worn all afternoon. Nobody looked at me differently because nobody suspected a thing. Chloe was discussing floral arrangements with the wedding planner. Ryan was laughing with Chloe's uncle about a baseball game. Monique sat at the center of the table, elegant and confident, holding a glass of iced tea as if she had not just spoken about me as though I were an obstacle to be managed. I took my seat and listened. That was all I did. I listened. For the rest of the lunch, every conversation felt different. Every compliment sounded rehearsed. Every smile seemed slightly forced. Perhaps I would have dismissed it all if I had not understood what had been said in the garden. But now I noticed things that had escaped me before. Whenever the discussion turned toward houses, investments, or retirement, Monique suddenly became very interested. Whenever someone mentioned Ryan's future, Chloe glanced toward her mother before answering. Small moments. Tiny details. Yet once you see a crack in the glass, it is impossible to pretend it is not there. That evening, I drove back to my home in Sacramento. The sun was setting over the highway, painting the sky with shades of gold and orange. Normally, drives like that helped me clear my mind. Not this time. My thoughts kept returning to one sentence. Helen is easier to manipulate than I expected. I repeated those words over and over. Manipulate. Not help. Not support. Manipulate. When I arrived home, the house was quiet. I placed my keys on the kitchen counter and stood there for several seconds. The same kitchen where I had cooked thousands of meals. The same house my husband and I had purchased more than 30 years earlier. Every room held memories. Every corner carried a piece of our lives. The idea that strangers were discussing its future without my knowledge unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I made a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the window overlooking my backyard. The oak tree my husband planted 20 years ago swayed gently in the evening breeze. I remembered something he used to tell me whenever business deals became complicated. People reveal themselves when they think nobody is paying attention. At the time I thought he was talking about work. Sitting there alone, I realized he had been talking about life. Around 9 o'clock Ryan called. His voice sounded cheerful. He thanked me for coming to the lunch and asked whether I enjoyed meeting more of Chloe's relatives. I closed my eyes for a moment. Then I told him the truth. Part of it anyway. I said it had been very interesting. And for the first time in my life, I decided not to share everything I knew with my son. Because before I spoke, I needed to understand exactly what game was being played around me. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was still dark, and for a few moments I simply sat at the edge of my bed listening to the silence. It was the kind of silence that reveals things you normally ignore. The hum of the refrigerator downstairs. The distant sound of traffic several blocks away. The creak of old wood settling into place. I made coffee and carried the mug to the sunroom where my husband and I used to spend Saturday mornings reading the newspaper together. The memories were comforting, but they also sharpened my thoughts. By now, I knew one thing with certainty. The conversation at the vineyard had not been an isolated moment. People do not suddenly discuss manipulating someone unless those discussions have happened before. Around noon Chloe called. Her voice was cheerful, almost overly cheerful. She wanted my opinion on wedding invitations. Gold lettering or silver lettering. Formal wording or modern wording. I answered politely and listened carefully. At one point she mentioned that Ryan had always talked about wanting a larger property someday. The comment seemed innocent enough, but something about the timing caught my attention. Ryan had never once mentioned moving during any of our recent conversations. Yet Chloe spoke as though plans were already taking shape. After we ended the call, I opened an old photo album. Not because I wanted to revisit the past, but because I needed to think. Page after page showed the life my husband and I had built together. Vacations. Holidays. Birthday parties. The first day we moved into this house. I paused on a photograph taken 22 years earlier. Ryan was smiling beside the oak tree in the backyard, holding the shovel he had used to help his father plant it. Looking at that picture reminded me of something important. Ryan had always been honest. Trusting perhaps. Sometimes too trusting. But never dishonest. That realization stayed with me all afternoon. The more I thought about it, the less I believed he knew what was being said behind closed doors. If he had known, he would never have allowed those conversations to happen. Later that evening I received a text message from Monique. She thanked me again for attending the lunch and suggested that the two of us meet for coffee sometime soon. I stared at the message for several seconds. The invitation seemed friendly, generous even. Yet after what I had overheard, every word felt different. Every gesture carried a second meaning. I replied with a warm response and agreed to meet. Then I set my phone down and looked out the window. For the first time since the vineyard, I had made a decision. I was not going to confront anyone. Not yet. If people are willing to reveal their true intentions when they believe you are unaware, then sometimes the smartest thing you can do is keep listening. 3 days later, I met Monique at a small cafe overlooking the river. It was one of those charming places with brick walls, fresh flowers on every table, and the smell of coffee drifting through the air. She arrived 10 minutes early. Perfectly dressed, perfectly composed, and carrying the same polished smile she always seemed to wear. Anyone watching us would have seen two future in-laws enjoying a pleasant afternoon together. I smiled and greeted her warmly. If she was surprised by my friendliness, she did not show it. We ordered coffee and exchanged polite conversation. She asked about my garden. I asked about her recent trip to Montreal. The discussion felt effortless on the surface. Yet beneath every sentence I sensed something else moving quietly underneath. Then the conversation shifted. It happened so naturally that another person might not have noticed it. Monique asked whether maintaining a large house by myself had become difficult. I laughed softly and told her I still enjoyed it. She nodded thoughtfully. A few minutes later, she asked whether I had ever considered downsizing. Again the question sounded harmless. Practical even. But after everything I had heard, I could not ignore the pattern. The subject returned a third time when she mentioned how many retirees were choosing luxury communities with clubhouses, fitness centers, and organized activities. I stirred my coffee and listened. The more she talked, the more interested she seemed in my future living arrangements. What fascinated me was not the question itself. It was the confidence behind it. She spoke as though certain decisions had already been made, as though my life was a project waiting to be organized. Before we left, she placed a gentle hand on my arm and said that Chloe cared deeply about family unity. The sentence sounded kind, yet for some reason it stayed with me during the entire drive home. Family unity. Later that evening, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing wedding notes Chloe had emailed earlier in the week. Guest lists, seating charts, venue details. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed something small. Very small. Several notes beside family seating arrangements had been updated. My seat had been moved twice. At first I dismissed it as normal wedding planning, but the changes consistently placed me farther away from Ryan. Not dramatically, just enough to create distance. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. Alone, each detail meant very little. A conversation, a question, a seating adjustment. But together they began forming a picture. Not a complete picture. Not yet. Still, I could feel the edges connecting. Someone was arranging pieces on a board. And for the first time, I started wondering whether the wedding itself was only one part of a much larger plan. The following week brought an unexpected development. Ryan called and asked whether I would join him for lunch downtown. There was nothing unusual about the invitation, but when I arrived, I immediately noticed that Chloe was not there. It was just the two of us. We ordered sandwiches and iced tea at a small restaurant overlooking the river. For the first half hour we talked about ordinary things. His work, my garden, the wedding schedule. Then, almost casually, he asked what I planned to do with the house someday. I felt my attention sharpen. Not because the question was inappropriate, but because it echoed the same topic that seemed to follow me everywhere lately. I smiled and asked what made him curious. Ryan shrugged and said the subject had come up recently during conversations about the future. He mentioned that Chloe and her family believed I might eventually want something smaller and easier to manage. The words landed quietly, but they confirmed something important. These discussions were happening far more often than I realized. What surprised me most was Ryan's expression. There was no greed in it. No calculation. Only concern. Genuine concern. That was the moment I became certain he was not part of whatever game was unfolding around me. He was being influenced, not directing it. As we finished lunch, he changed the subject and began talking enthusiastically about the honeymoon. Yet the earlier conversation remained in my mind. That evening, while organizing documents in my home office, I found myself reviewing years of financial records. Not because I suspected anything illegal. I simply wanted clarity. My husband had always believed that understanding your affairs gave you freedom. As I sorted paperwork, I noticed how frequently Chloe had asked questions during the past year. Questions about property taxes, insurance, home values, estate planning. At the time, each question seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern that was becoming difficult to ignore. A few days later, another piece of the puzzle appeared. Chloe sent a group email to several family members regarding wedding accommodations. Included by mistake was an earlier message chain. Most of it involved hotel reservations and transportation. Then I noticed a sentence from Monique. It was brief. Just one line. Yet it held my attention for several minutes. We need to keep everything moving forward before she changes her mind. There was no explanation. No context. Perhaps it referred to wedding logistics. Perhaps it did not. I read the sentence 3 times before closing the email. Then I sat quietly in my office, staring out the window at the oak tree in the backyard. The branches moved gently in the afternoon breeze. Somewhere beyond those branches, a storm was gathering. I still could not see its full shape. But with every passing day, I could feel it drawing closer. The breakthrough came when I stopped looking for big answers and started paying attention to small details. A week after the email incident, Chloe invited me to tour a wedding venue that had recently become available due to a cancellation. Ryan was busy at work, so it was just the two of us. The venue was beautiful. A restored estate with white columns, manicured gardens, and a ballroom filled with natural light. Chloe spent nearly 2 hours discussing decorations, menus, and guest seating. I listened patiently and offered suggestions whenever she asked. Then, during a conversation about family photographs, she said something that caught my attention. She mentioned how much easier future holidays would be once everyone was living closer together. I asked what she meant. She quickly smiled and said she was only thinking out loud. Yet moments later she began describing neighborhoods near her parents' home, communities, retirement developments, smaller houses. The same subjects kept appearing no matter where the conversation began. On the drive home I replayed every word in my mind. Later that evening, I decided to test a theory. During a phone call with Ryan, I casually mentioned that I had recently met with a financial advisor. That part was true. Then I added something that was not. I told him I was considering selling my house within the next year, and possibly purchasing a condominium near the coast. Ryan sounded surprised but supportive. He said my happiness was what mattered most. We ended the conversation and I waited. 3 days later, Monique called unexpectedly. Her voice carried an excitement she attempted to hide beneath polite concern. She asked whether I was truly thinking about moving. She asked whether I had selected a realtor. She asked whether I had decided how to invest the proceeds from the sale. I answered carefully and revealed very little. After we hung up, I sat quietly in my kitchen. My hands rested on the table. My coffee grew cold beside me. The information had traveled exactly where I expected it would. Ryan had only known for 3 days. Yet somehow Monique already seemed deeply interested in details I had never shared. For the first time, I felt certain that I was no longer observing random behavior. I was watching information move through a network of conversations, hidden just beneath the surface. The realization did not make me angry. It made me calm. Calm people notice things. Calm people wait. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched across the backyard. The oak tree cast a long shadow over the grass. I looked at it for a long time and remembered something else my husband once told me. The truth has a strange habit of revealing itself when people become too confident. And from what I had seen lately, confidence was becoming their greatest weakness. 2 weeks before the wedding, an unexpected ally entered the story. His name was Daniel Bennett, Chloe's father. Unlike Monique, Daniel rarely spoke during family gatherings. He was polite, reserved, and often seemed content to stay in the background while others controlled the conversation. I had always assumed that was simply his personality. Then one Thursday afternoon he called and asked if we could meet privately. His voice sounded uneasy. We agreed to meet at a quiet diner, halfway between our homes. When I arrived, Daniel was already seated in a corner booth nursing a cup of coffee. He looked tired. Not physically tired, but emotionally exhausted. After a few minutes of small talk, he stared down at the table and sighed. "Helen," he said softly, "I need to ask you something." I nodded. He hesitated before continuing. "Have you noticed that Monique has become unusually interested in your future plans?" The question surprised me, though I was careful not to show it. I simply smiled and said that wedding planning seemed to make everyone curious about everyone else's future. Daniel gave a short laugh that contained no humor. Then he looked out the window for several seconds before speaking again. "It is more than that." His words came slowly, as though he had been carrying them for a long time. He explained that over the past year, Monique had become increasingly focused on financial matters involving Ryan and me. Property values, inheritance planning, home ownership, retirement assets. At first he thought she was simply concerned about her daughter's future. But gradually the conversations became more frequent, more detailed, more calculated. I listened quietly. Daniel never accused anyone directly. He never raised his voice. Yet everything he said confirmed the uneasy picture that had been forming in my mind. The most revealing part came near the end of our conversation. Daniel admitted that he and Monique had argued several times about boundaries. According to him, she believed that once Chloe married Ryan, family assets should be viewed as shared opportunities. Even hearing the phrase made my stomach tighten. Shared opportunities. It sounded so harmless, so reasonable. Yet beneath those words I sensed the same attitude I had overheard at the vineyard. Before we left, Daniel looked at me carefully. "Ryan seems like a good man," he said. "I do not think he knows how these conversations sound when he is not around." I agreed. We shook hands and went our separate ways. Driving home, I felt strangely relieved. Not because the situation was improving, but because I was no longer relying on instinct alone. Another piece had fallen into place. And with every piece that appeared, the distance between suspicion and certainty grew smaller. After meeting Daniel, I changed nothing about my behavior. At least that was how it appeared from the outside. I continued answering Chloe's calls. I attended planning meetings. I smiled during family dinners. The difference was that I had stopped taking people at face value. Instead, I paid attention to patterns, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Almost immediately after my conversation with Daniel, Chloe's attitude toward me seemed to shift. She became unusually attentive. She called more often. She asked whether I needed help around the house. She even brought me flowers one afternoon for no particular reason. A year earlier, I might have viewed these gestures as kindness. Now they felt different. Not because kindness is suspicious, but because the timing was too perfect. One Saturday morning, she arrived with coffee and pastries from a bakery she knew I liked. We sat on my back patio overlooking the yard. The oak tree cast long shadows across the grass while we talked about wedding details. Then, almost casually, she asked whether I had made any decisions about moving closer to the coast. I nearly smiled. The false story was still traveling exactly where I expected. I told her I was considering several options but had not made a final decision. She seemed disappointed by the lack of specifics. The expression lasted less than a second, but I noticed it. A few days later, another opportunity presented itself. During a family video call about wedding logistics, I mentioned that a real estate consultant had recently estimated the value of my home. The statement was true. The number I shared was not. I deliberately inflated it by nearly $500,000. Nobody reacted strongly during the call. Yet less than 48 hours later, Monique called to congratulate me on owning such a valuable property. She even repeated the exact figure I had mentioned. The precision of it caught my attention. Information was not merely being shared. It was being tracked. That evening, I sat alone in my sunroom watching the sky darken beyond the backyard. The house felt peaceful, safe, familiar. For the first time in weeks, I no longer felt confused. I was beginning to understand the structure of what was happening. Chloe was not acting alone. Monique was not simply offering opinions. Together, they seemed to be building expectations about a future that included decisions they believed would eventually benefit them. The troubling part was not their assumptions. It was how confident they seemed that those assumptions would become reality. I looked at the framed photograph of my husband sitting beside my favorite chair. His smile appeared calm and steady as always. I found myself smiling back. Because while they believed they were gathering information about me, they had failed to notice something important. I had quietly started gathering information about them. 1 week before the wedding, the entire family gathered for the final rehearsal dinner planning session at the estate where the ceremony would take place. The atmosphere was cheerful. Staff members moved between tables carrying sample menus and floral arrangements, while relatives discussed travel plans and hotel reservations. On the surface, everything appeared perfect. Yet I had learned that appearances often conceal more than they reveal. I arrived early and spent time walking through the property. The gardens were beautiful. White roses lined the stone pathways, and strings of lights hung from the trees waiting for the celebration. As guests slowly arrived, I noticed Chloe and Monique speaking quietly with several relatives near the outdoor terrace. The moment they saw me approaching, the conversation changed direction. It was subtle, a different subject, a different tone, but I noticed. Later that afternoon, while everyone reviewed seating assignments, I introduced another piece of information into the conversation. I casually mentioned that I had recently met with my attorney to update several personal documents before making major life changes. The statement was vague by design. I offered no details. I simply allowed the sentence to exist and watched what happened. The reaction was immediate. Chloe smiled a little too quickly. Monique became unusually attentive. Several questions followed. Had I finalized my plans? Was I still considering coastal properties? Was I restructuring my finances before moving? I answered carefully, revealing nothing while appearing completely open. The more I listened, the more confident they seemed to become. Then something happened that confirmed everything Daniel had told me. During a break in the meeting, I stepped outside onto a balcony overlooking the gardens below. A few moments later, I heard familiar voices from around the corner. French. Calm. Casual. They did not know I was there. They spoke as though the future had already been decided. As though my house had already been sold. As though my next chapter had already been arranged. They discussed timelines. Expectations. Possibilities. Every sentence carried the same assumption. That I would eventually make choices benefiting plans I had never agreed to. I remained perfectly still and listened until the conversation ended. When I returned inside, nobody noticed anything unusual. I smiled. I complimented the floral displays. I thanked the event coordinator. But internally something had changed. For weeks I had been collecting fragments. Conversations. Questions. Reactions. Now the fragments finally formed a complete picture. The wedding was only days away. Everyone believed the biggest surprise would happen at the ceremony. They were wrong. The biggest surprise was already waiting for them. They just did not know it yet. The wedding day arrived beneath a clear California sky. Guests filled the estate long before the ceremony began. Laughter drifted across the gardens. Cameras flashed. Music played softly near the fountain. Everywhere I looked, people seemed caught up in the excitement of the occasion. I wore a navy blue dress and a pearl necklace that had belonged to my mother. Outwardly I appeared calm. In truth, I had never been more focused. Over the previous weeks I had listened carefully, observed quietly, and allowed everyone to believe exactly what they wanted to believe. That morning, Chloe greeted me with unusual enthusiasm. She hugged me tightly and asked whether I was excited about the future. Monique stood nearby smiling. There was confidence in her expression. Confidence built on assumptions. Confidence built on information she thought she understood. Throughout the afternoon, I noticed the same pattern repeating itself. Whenever conversations turned toward family, homes, or future plans, Monique seemed unable to hide her interest. More than once, I caught her exchanging knowing glances with relatives from her side of the family. They behaved as though a favorable outcome was already guaranteed. During the reception, guests moved between the ballroom and the outdoor terrace. The celebration flowed smoothly. Ryan looked genuinely happy. Watching him laugh with friends reminded me why I had remained patient. He deserved the truth. He deserved to see people clearly before making decisions that would shape the rest of his life. As sunset painted the sky with shades of gold and pink, a group gathered near the terrace overlooking the vineyards. I recognized several members of Chloe's family. Monique stood among them. They began speaking French. The conversation started casually. Then it shifted. They spoke about future property decisions. They spoke about expectations. They spoke about plans involving me as though I were not a person but a variable in an equation. A few of them laughed. One comment was particularly revealing. Another relative remarked that some people never realize they are being guided until it is too late. Monique responded with a confident smile. Around them, no one seemed aware of what was being said. They assumed complete privacy. They assumed complete safety. I stood only a short distance away holding a glass of sparkling water. The evening breeze moved gently through the vineyard. The lights hanging from the trees glowed softly above the guests. I listened to every word. When the conversation finally ended, Monique turned and noticed me standing nearby. She smiled politely. I smiled back. Neither of us spoke. Yet for the first time since this story began, I knew the moment I had been waiting for was only minutes away. The opportunity arrived during the reception speeches. Guests gathered beneath the lights strung across the terrace while servers moved quietly between tables. The evening had settled into that comfortable stage where everyone felt relaxed and confident. Ryan had just finished thanking family and friends for supporting him throughout his life. Applause filled the space. Then he invited anyone who wished to share a few words to come forward. I stood slowly from my seat. Several guests smiled. A few raised their glasses. Nobody appeared concerned. Why would they be? To everyone present, I was simply the proud mother of the groom. I walked to the microphone and thanked everyone for being there. I spoke about Ryan's kindness, his honesty, and the values his father had taught him. The audience listened attentively. Then I turned toward Chloe and welcomed her into the family. For a brief moment, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Then I smiled and said there was one more thing I wanted to share. The room grew quiet. I explained that family is built on trust. Trust requires honesty. Honesty requires people to say the same things in private that they say in public. Several guests nodded. Across the terrace, I noticed Monique watching me carefully. Then I began speaking in French. Not a phrase. Not a greeting. Several complete sentences. The effect was immediate. Conversations stopped. Smiles faded. A few members of Chloe's family stared at me in disbelief. I continued calmly. I repeated comments I had overheard during the past several weeks. Comments about manipulating decisions. Comments about property. Comments about future plans that had been discussed without my knowledge. I repeated them exactly as they had originally been spoken. Then I translated every sentence into English for the rest of the guests. The silence that followed felt endless. Ryan looked from me to Chloe, then toward Monique. His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. Chloe's face lost color. Monique remained frozen in her chair. Nobody interrupted me because nobody could. I was not offering opinions. I was repeating their own words. When I finished, I placed the microphone back on its stand. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone of anything. I simply explained how long I had understood every conversation they believed was hidden behind another language. Then I returned to my seat. Around me, guests exchanged stunned glances. Across the terrace, Daniel lowered his eyes and slowly shook his head. Ryan remained standing near the dance floor, completely silent. In that moment, the carefully managed version of reality that had existed for months finally disappeared. And once the truth was visible to everyone, there was no way to hide it again. The remainder of the evening unfolded far differently than anyone had expected. For several minutes after I returned to my seat, nobody seemed to know what to say. The music had stopped. Conversations had faded into silence. Guests sat quietly, absorbing what they had just witnessed. Ryan remained standing near the center of the terrace. I could see him replaying everything in his mind. The comments. The translations. The weeks of conversations he never knew existed. Eventually he walked toward me. There was no anger in his expression, only disappointment and sadness. He asked one simple question. How long have you known? I answered honestly. Since the lunch at the vineyard. His eyes widened slightly. Then he looked toward Chloe and Monique. Neither of them spoke. Neither denied what had been said. In many ways, that silence told him more than any explanation ever could. The reception ended early. Some guests left quietly. Others offered kind words before departing. Daniel approached me before he left and thanked me for handling the situation with dignity. He looked older than he had a few weeks earlier. Relieved too. As though a burden had finally been lifted. Over the following days, difficult conversations took place. Ryan spent time reflecting on everything he had learned. He asked questions. He listened carefully. Most importantly, he stopped accepting assumptions without examining them. The wedding plans were eventually canceled. Not because of a single conversation, but because trust had been damaged beyond repair. Relationships cannot thrive when honesty is missing. That lesson was painful but necessary. Several months later, life looked very different. Ryan had moved into a new apartment closer to his office and was focusing on rebuilding his future. We spoke often. In some ways, our relationship became stronger than it had been in years. The distance created by outside influences slowly disappeared. As for me, I remained exactly where I wanted to be. In the same house. Beneath the same oak tree my husband and son planted together all those years ago. Every morning, I sat in the sunroom with my coffee and watched the sunlight move across the backyard. Peace returned gradually, one day at a time. Sometimes people ask whether I regret revealing the truth. The answer is simple. No. The truth did not destroy anything worth keeping. It revealed what was already broken. Looking back, the most surprising part of the entire experience was not what I overheard. It was how confidently people believed they could shape another person's future without their knowledge. They mistook silence for weakness. They mistook kindness for ignorance. They mistook patience for surrender. In the end, I never needed revenge. I never needed an argument. All I needed was the truth. Because truth has a way of accomplishing what deception never can. It allows people to see each other clearly. And once that happens, every important decision becomes much easier to